Welcome back. This is Daybreak on Citizen Television. Thank you for staying with us. Budget Day here on the broadcast. The focus now shifts to Parliament, where this afternoon the Treasury Cabinet Secretary, Professor Njuguna Ndung'u, will be appearing before the House, and it's part of the first financial year's budget for the Kenya Kwanza administration and the maiden debut to be made by the Treasury Cabinet Secretary, who will today read President William Ruto's maiden budget as his administration gears up to deliver his election promises and pledges, even though the paper says some of the tax proposals have come up against stiff opposition and headwinds. And while Dr. Ruto says we must all endure the pain before things get better, a majority of Kenyans are already feeling the pinch of the high cost of living. Will he relieve the burden on the shoulders of the Kenyan people? And before we went on a break, and coming back to the housing levy, which is now a 1.5% housing tax, over the presentations made by the committee chairperson, as this money now will be channeled to the consolidated fund, which means that you will not be refunded. Earlier on it was a contribution over a 7-year period, then you will get back your money. And Grace, coming to you, what do you think might have led to the change of mind by the committee in moving from being the housing fund to now becoming a tax, which is 1.5%, half of what was initially proposed?
You know, first of all, there was a lot of hue and cry from the entire Kenyan public. But secondly, I'm not even sure they've understood why there was hue and cry. Number one, the initial proposal was 3%, but it was capped at 2,500 for the employee and 2,500 for the employer. And after 7 years, we would at least get a refund of that contribution. That was number one. And the question was whether this was a tax or whether it was a contribution. And we settled for the fact that it was a contribution, but which could be defined as a social tax. Now, the 1.5% is way higher than the 3% that had initially been proposed.
In terms of? Because
it is not capped. 1.5% of your salary, which is not capped, if you earn anything above 167,000 shillings, you're going to pay more than the 2,500, which had already been capped.
The earlier proposal, which had capping.
Yes. So if your income is higher than this, we will be paying a much higher tax, and we're not getting a refund for it. So really, they're dangling a carrot. They've given us with one hand and taken it away with the other. So the 1.5% is really, really, really more punitive than the 3%. Now, from the discussions that have been ongoing and the report that we've received from the chair of the committee, what they're saying is they'll probably open it up to all Kenyans to be able to participate in the housing projects. And so we're all eligible to be able to purchase a house. The 1.5% is very high. Is it something that is sustainable for all of us? And number two, whilst they are saying it's a free house, it's not a free house, because we all have to raise a deposit of, was it 12.5%? So, I mean, it just means, you know, we are back to square zero where we were, because what we are saying is the government is forcing me to purchase a house. I probably have a house. Maybe I'm not interested in a house. Maybe that's not my priority. So the 1.5%, I personally am still not for it, and I'm hoping that this is still dropped from the bill. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I just to add to what Grace has said, anybody earning beyond 83,000, actually it's not even 160. The 2,500
is really high.
At 3% would be contribution by somebody who's earning about 83,000. So 1.5% is much higher, but I think it's because of the cry that came from the public. But I want to look at it from the point of view of why the housing levy or why this affordable housing. I don't know if the government promised free housing. Personally, my feel is that this is to go towards affordable housing. And housing, as we all know, is a key factor in the cost of labor. So you look at it, we had also shared statistics earlier about the average Kenyan earning probably less than 100,000. And many Kenyans, going by the cost of rent currently in the cities where we live, unless you live in the informal settlement and other places, are spending probably 50, 60% of their pay, I would say 40% and above, on rent. So there's been outcry even from the employers. I mean, it's both sides, the employees and the employer. But at the end of the day, I think it's a noble idea. Whether this is going to succeed is another issue. Of course, as we are proposing this levy, and Grace, I also wanted to mention that we are talking of initial proposal and current, but this has not been passed yet.
Correct.
These are proposals. So, like I talked about a full cycle, we are yet to hear the end of it and what will pass. Probably it will be totally rejected. Probably we'll go back to the 3%, but there have been proposals to revise that. So for me, it's a good idea, the housing project. As an employer, I would look at it. If your employees are able to afford maybe housing that they pay rent at 5,000 versus when they're paying at 40,000, then probably for you, what you'll be paying this employee would also not cost you so much in terms of cost of labor. If we go out and roll the plans so that in areas where we're planning to do projects and housing is available and there's affordable labor, then it's a win-win situation for both. So I would want to look at it that way, see how this takes off, how it's implemented, and we just hope it may take a bit of time. At 250,000 houses a year in different regions, that is still a drop in the ocean. So slowly but surely, I hope this is going to make a change. And with the good intention that the government has, I'm just hoping that it all goes well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
From a governance, accountability point of view, it's really asking what's the problem the government is trying to cure, and has this scheme targeted that problem? And as my colleagues are saying here, is it the cost of housing? Is it access to housing? Is it housing for the vulnerable? What problem are they trying to cure? The next thing is, what is the supply and distribution mechanism? Supply in terms of, there's going to be a whole procurement around the construction of houses. How accountable is that? We want to make sure these houses aren't then being dished out as political favors to some select people with political linkages to now to benefit of the sweat of Kenyans. And then the distribution, how will the houses be allocated? We know in some, all people deserve dignified, to live in a dignified, safe environment. That's a given, and it's good, and that's why this is a noble initiative. But then how will these houses be distributed? To whom will they be given? Because we know other housing schemes tend to benefit those who are, especially when it comes to purchase, those who are politically connected, as opposed to those who have the most need, or maybe even those who have contributed. So I don't see why, and the problem with this is the government started with the money. You see, they came saying we are bringing a levy. And the question is, for what? What if they had started with, this is our rationale, this is the population that we have identified that is vulnerable or in need, and this is how we are going to finance it? It would be an entirely different conversation, and Parliament should really just hold back. This proposal can be brought at any other time. It can be brought as a special bill because it is a noble objective, but the manner in which it's being fronted and the lack of accountability is just making Kenyans very uneasy.
Okay, I'll come to Sandeep. Yes, please.
Okay. What I wanted to add to Wanjiro's contribution. Sorry, I keep calling her Wanjiru. So I managed to call her Wanjiru this time. She says probably the government should have started by giving her the statistics. But again, I look at the process of coming up with a bill. I mean, it starts with that stage of problem identification, among other things. So probably there's data somewhere that the public hasn't accessed. There's a lot of politicizing of all these things. Like, we all agree it's a noble idea. But the information that goes out there to the public and what we get to hear and what we focus on could be totally different. At the end of the day, probably not everybody will own a house. But again, looking at supply versus demand coming into play. So if more houses are available, automatically I'm thinking even the rent. We will not be paying as high rents. People will be having more dignified houses at a lower cost. So I still stick to the win-win kind of position.
What about the people who already own their houses? The majority of Kenyans who own their houses, majority of Kenyans who own their houses in the rural area. What are we saying? Are they then locked out of this, or and then are their houses of requisite standard? Is that dignified living? So there are so many questions that need to be answered before this. Yeah, so, we don't know that. No, you see, it hasn't been thought through. This thing is being figured out on the go. That's not how you do policy. That's not how you come and raid the pockets of people on a half-baked solution. Fix it, and then bring it.
Sandeep, I'll come to you.
Let me just make a few comments. I know this is a very emotive topic, housing levy or housing fund. So let's talk about how it started. 2018 was the first time we heard about the housing fund, not necessarily a levy. And if you look at those regulations, which I think were thrown out by the courts, they talk about it being voluntary at that point in time. That made sense, right? But it was still stopped at that point. Now, fast forward to today, we have the finance bill that talks about 3% employer-employee, capped at 2.5. The reason why it changed, or why we are looking at maybe possible changes to the making it 1.5, is because, again, of equity. Someone earning 100,000, 3% of that is like what, 3K, so capped at 2.5. Someone earning 1 million shillings, again 2.5. So there was no equality in that. So that's why they had to say, fine, you don't want it to be a contribution, mandatory contribution. And remember, as it stands right now, it is still affordable housing and locked out. Whether you contribute, whether you're high end or not, you will still not get a house, as it stands with 3%. The proposal that they're making to amend that, and of course it's not yet been looked at, the 1.5 now opens up to everyone. Whether you're earning 100K or whether you're earning 1 million shillings, you qualify for a house. Now, whether you take up a house or not is a secondary conversation. So yes, you could have your houses, you could be paying a mortgage to own a house, but you still, if this goes through, you'll still be required forcefully to pay, because it's a tax, to pay to benefit. So we call you a patriot. Thank you for your contribution, is what this proposal will do. But I think the issue, the current proposal of 3%, maybe apart from the issue of capping, would be you're going to get back the money. The government should have demystified and said, these houses are not free. Yes, everyone deserves a house, and you talked about the standard of the house. Maybe a person earning 1 million will not want to live in a small square footage, but will be forced to buy if the 1.5 comes. But the 3%, even the person earning 1 million will contribute, but will not be entitled to a house. What is that person doing? He is earning an interest. They talked about it in the finance bill. You'll get an interest. Could that be equitable to a bond? The government is looking for borrowing, is looking for funding. You are financing the government to build affordable housing. That would be the point. But they didn't clarify what interest would you earn. If they said you'll get 10% or 14%, or I'm hearing now 15%, I'm okay, fine, I'll force myself to contribute, but I know at the end of the 7th year, I get back my contribution and my employer, because they talk about contributions. I think the challenge that I face with the current bill as proposed is that they talk about 3 ways of you can get this money back, and the third way was cash. And they said if you're taking the money back in cash, you're going to be taxed. But I'm paying the contribution as it stands is out of my taxed money. That is the issue Kenyans had. That's what issue that Kenyans had, is that it's not a relief against my gross pay. I'm going to pay for it, yes, out of my net pay, as it stands right now. But now when it goes to 1.5, hey, you are worse off, as she's mentioned rightfully. But the idea of the housing fund is to build houses, to collect money, to build houses, to stop what we're calling borrowing. Let us be self-sustaining. And that is what I think we need to understand, is that the houses are not free. Go to My Boma, if you know that website. There's the criteria, so not everyone will get a house. It's dependent on an income. I heard someone say that, you know, fine, you can give someone a house, because I think the government is advertising it as free housing. But if they don't have an income, how do they sustain that house? Electricity, water, food.
No, not everyone will get a house, but everyone will pay.
Well, if the 1.5 goes through, yes. But the 1.5, you can still get a house if you want. But the current 3%, no, not everyone will get a house. But you'll get back your money with an interest. The question, of course, is whether you'll actually get back your money or not. Is secondary. But if they use the bond model where you are guaranteed of the interest, maybe amortization, and then you get back your principal, I think that would have really worked.
Yes, Grace, before we proceed to agriculture.
And I think the other problem that Kenyans have is you know, depending on whether the 3% goes through or the 1.5, hopefully none goes through. But if we stick to the 1.5, for example, which is not capped, I'm already paying tax at 30%, earning below 500,000. If I'm earning above 500,000, potentially going to pay 35%. 35. Let's talk about what's in the bill as it stands, 35. And then plus 1.5, that makes it 36.5. If I have to pay NHIF, which is not capped, that's 2.75. So my effective tax rate is almost 38.2%, almost 40%.
You forgot NSSF.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I forgot NSSF. We're still paying for NSSF. And some of those are not deductible, hence, you know, the additional tax. So effectively, I think there's too many taxes at the same time. And Wanjiru mentioned, maybe some needed to be staggered. And then you explain to Kenyans, and we all understand why we need to do what we are doing. If it's a good idea, you know, and it comes slowly, and we've already seen maybe what NHIF has done for me. I've probably seen the houses standing, you know, a set of 250,000 houses or 50,000. Then we do it slowly. NHIF is working, NSSF is working, the housing levy is working, you know, manufacturing, everything, you know, just staggered. But there's too many taxes. There's turnover tax. There's, you know, we are individuals. So some of those individuals are also paying the turnover tax. We're the same ones who are paying value-added tax. We're paying excise tax on money transfer services. So because there's too many taxes coming at the same time, and in fact, this is why we are saying, for the first time in Kenya's history, so many people are talking about the finance bill. You know, I got myself into an Uber, and the driver was asking me, I told him I'm coming here, and he was asking me, are you going to talk about the budget? I mean, at some point, some people didn't even know what the finance bill is. But because of too many taxes at the same time, when the cost of living is already very high, it just, you know, overwhelms us. Because like I said, we have to pay for all the services. If I knew that some of the services, I would be relieved of some of the services, I'd probably be happy to pay. Because his contribution and her contribution and my contribution helps all of us, and probably those who are not earning as much as others are earning. Okay,
and the point is that when I last talked to the president at State House, he compared, for example, Kenya and France. In France, people don't pay for electricity and water. That is a social welfare state. Everything has been catered for. But a plan that also was mulled post the World War II in 1945 to set up most European states as social welfare states. But here in Kenya, we pay for electricity, we pay for water. But
everything.
We pay for everything. The infrastructure is so wanting to the extent that you have no proper education, you have no, I mean, mechanism, you have no better infrastructure than them. And you also have no better medication, because you look at public hospitals on the estate, it's wanting. Doctors are fleeing out of the country because of poor pay from the government and the equipment needed at national hospitals, which are not forthcoming. And to couple it up, the corruption at the Kenya Medical Supplies Agency, KEMSA, though the president had taken an action in changing the board. Coming to you, Rispa, I'm looking at agriculture, 65.2 billion Kenya shillings, crops 46.4 billion, and livestock 18.5. That comes to about 65.25 billion, not 5 billion, 65.2 billion Kenya shillings. Food security is a key element. And the president has been on record. We will not subsidize consumption, we will subsidize production. And there he has a genuine point, because he wants to spur the production of food from the farm level to the household. And then once you address that part, then the cost of living automatically descends. Again, in terms of value addition of what we export as a country, is there enough policy or policies and a framework to guide that, to make Kenya now, because I'm looking at pyrethrum, coffee, tea, flowers, to most European states and Asia, to make Kenya, therefore, through policy and framework, resource mobilized, export-oriented economy, to target agriculture, create more jobs, make the country food secure, bring down the cost of living?
Thank you, Ayub. Most of your questions are loaded, as my colleagues have mentioned, and this is another one. So if I miss on anything, I hope they will just pick it and respond. When I look at the allocation for agriculture and livestock, I start by saying I'm glad that I can see an allocation towards livestock, because it tends to be forgotten in all this discussion around agriculture. So that's a good thing. And the subsidy that we're expecting on fertilizer and the seeds and all that, I want to believe will go a long way in just relieving the agricultural sector or motivating people to go more into this sector to ensure that we are food secure, like you said. My only worry is that there seems to be more focus on the consumption element. When we talk of most of the people who, maybe where I come from, we don't do large-scale farming. People still expect the subsidized fertilizer, among other things, but you look at the level of production, it's more for their own consumption. Yet, at the end of the day, what will really be a game changer is we focused on production that, of course, will make us food secure, but also earn us the foreign exchange through exports. So it's my hope, really, that as we go this direction, there'll be more focus to ensure that our farmers or the citizens focus on the production of pyrethrum, coffee, tea. And this should also be exported with a bit of value add, because as it is now, the production is there. If we take that coffee and send it out for others to do the processing and other things, then our farmers still tend to languish in poverty, really. They're not benefiting from it. So it's a good move by the government. I'm glad they're covering both crop and livestock. It's my prayer that they will continue to encourage our farmers to go beyond production for their own consumption, domestic consumption, and look at the bigger picture. Because at the end of the day, when we talk of poor infrastructure, there's a lot of relationship in all these things. How are they going to get their crops to the market? Part of the big-scale farming is also affected by VAT on fuel and other things, because we are moving away from the manual farming to using machines and other things. This, again, is affected by the levy on tax on fuel and all that. So this is good. Let's look at it wholly, from end to end. We do this production. We are not going to hear of farmers having maize rotting or potatoes that have been produced but cannot go to the market. And beyond our local consumption, can we look at how we are going to earn foreign exchange on this moving forward?
And the periodic problem. Yes, Wanjiru. Is this commensurate? Because I remember the president passionately on the 30th of June, when he was the presidential candidate, when he launched his manifesto, he passionately, off the cuff, took time to explain to the Kenyan people why agriculture is key, why food security is important. He never read a speech and fielded questions thereafter, especially from people who were seated in the crowd at the Kasarani Gymnasium. Is that commensurate to the proposal as contained here, and going forward, is that practical?
Yeah, I think on a positive note, these discussions never happened. So even the pledges of the president as a candidate on agriculture were a plus, because we really were not having that conversation. Like I said, also in the budget, seeing the emphasis on the value chains, and they've been, kind of talking about opening up these chains. There's an allocation that has been made just on that process. That is a plus. I think the system is extremely broken, and the extent to which it works also depends on the enablers, because you can do the value chains, that's an analysis. You then need to implement it. And you need to recognize, because you're working with small shareholder farmers, the only way you can empower and transfer that money is through the cooperatives, because government can't afford to work with individuals. And I've heard them talking about, yes, working with the cooperatives, but when you look at the budget allocation, there is no additional allocation to the Ministry of Cooperatives. And so I say, yes, good promises, but the budget is not fully aligning with that. The other thing, and this is a repeat, and I'll say this because we are working under a devolved government, and agriculture is a devolved function. And it is a function that has contributed and continues to contribute greatly to our GDP. I think it's around 25, 27, 28%, but it's underfunded. So that you're on 4% instead of what's the recommended 8% contribution. When you look at this budget, the allocation is, remains at 4%. So when you factor in the cost of inflation and those other factors, you can even say that government is defunding agriculture, is defunding devolution. So my concern is, will the promises be held out? And how do we hold government to account? Maize farmers in Kitale, for instance, At present, I have a friend whose family does maize farming, and they're saying they're going to uproot their maize because they can't get a good price to sell their maize. They don't have access to the markets, and the price at which government is buying is so low because government imported maize. So, yes, they are saying this, but in real time, we are seeing that the importation of maize continued on the grounds that we had a deficit and we were facing a drought, which is fine, but farmers were then holding maize that the government could have bought. So this system is very broken. There are brokers who benefit from the importation of commodities, and the government proposes to dismantle them, but they need to do that, quickly enough, and some of these brokers are political. So one way or the other, we can't avoid the accountability issue. And it comes down to the vested interests and the rent seeking, which are those interests are the ones that have kept these small-scale farmers really in poverty. Look at what happened to Githongori Dairy. Yes, that's a very good example of how you help small-scale farmers climb up the value chain by helping them organize themselves so that they can make meaningful income and really enrich their local area. And then government instituted policies that actually were very hostile towards this cooperative. So the question for me is, where is the money, and are you going to deal with the interests?
Yes, guys.
Yeah. And also, just to add on to accountability and obviously production, and you asked for the specific proposals in the bill. On pesticides and fertilizers, there had been a proposal to move them from the zero-rated to exempt, which was obviously going to make them more expensive. We've heard that those might be reverted back to zero-rated, which is the current status.
Is it then beneficial, or
sorry?
Is it going to be of advantage?
When zero-rated, yes, because the government finances the value-added tax. But when it's exempt, no. The business owner will finance the value-added tax, which inevitably would mean that they'll pass that cost to the consumer.
Okay. As you proceed, how then would you explain to the farmer watching, say, from Nyeri, Trans Nzoia, and the food basket regions of this country, the difference between zero-rated and exempt?
Okay.
In layman's language, use Swahili even if you want.
Okay. In layman's language, I have a cost of input. There's what I need to make my fertilizer so that I can sell my fertilizer. So if what I am using to make my fertilizer is zero-rated, for example, but then when I'm selling, it is exempt, I'm going to be in a situation where I first have to apportion my VAT, etc., and I might end up in refunds. So I will be financing the government, and they'll be sitting with my money. But if it's my inputs are zero-rated, my output is zero-rated, then the government is taking care of the full tax, and the consumer doesn't have to bear the burden because the business owner will not transfer, the farmer will not transfer that cost to me, or the manufacturer of the pesticides or the fertilizer. Yeah, so that's what it is.
Yes. Proceed with your
so
point.
It becomes cheaper. I mean, the zero rating is important because this is important. It's essential goods that we're talking about. Fertilizer is essential. Now, fertilizer is already subsidized. Accountability. The other day we saw in Lunga Lunga, a full warehouse of fertilizers, which are subsidized by the government, and all that had been repackaged for sale at the full price. Somebody in government must be responsible for that, because the owner of the warehouse and the managers who are arrested, where did they get the fertilizer from? Somebody from government gave that fertilizer to them, and then it was repackaged. So I think, again, at the end of the day, it's accountability. And even as we look at the value chain, the production, the labor, the financing, and then the entrepreneurship, the financing is also questionable. If we're looking at mechanized farming, the allocation is not sufficient. And if we are looking at mechanized farming, and we're talking about VAT on fuel, what are we then saying? Because that makes it expensive to also run the mechanized farming. And even as Wanjiru said, I think middlemen, some of us, our parents are farmers, some of us are farmers. It's very difficult to get access to the market. I also have a friend who, had decided to grow a whole very many acres of melon, but what they had expected, you know, what they sell for that melon and what you buy it off the market as a retailer is ridiculous. You would really just uproot the melons and probably feed your cows or just stop the business altogether, which is what he did, because it's very difficult to access the market. So whilst there are proposals, you know, aimed at, you know, increasing growth in agriculture, etc., I think it's a wider discussion, and there's the entire chain, food chain needs to be looked at. And I like the slogan from Naivas, when you sit to eat, please thank the farmer, because they've gone through so much to get that food to your table.
The chain you've explained, they're in. Okay, I'll come to you, Rispa. Sandeep, the investment in agriculture is dovetailed by the cost of transport, for example, as mentioned here. Yet there is a proposal to increase VAT from the current 8% to 16%. Obviously, it's going to change the prices of the palm. And that push will end up on the consumer's end, who in this case includes the farmer, you, all of us seated here. And despite making all this investment in agriculture and the proposed allocation to the agriculture sector by the president, him being passionate about it, isn't it also going to be pedaling back and a further push on the consumer, for example, on the farmer, who would want his produce to leave Kitale, say in Trans Nzoia, and it has to reach Lamu County, then he has to cater for the cost of the logistics. I mean, is it on one hand helping here and then on the other not helping by increasing the VAT on fuel from 8 to 16%?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ayub. VAT on fuel. Fuel is an essential commodity. If you look at the pricing of the fuel, I know the prices have changed, but the previous ones, if you look at the proportion of the fuel cost, there's a significant amount that relates to taxes over and above just the VAT. Now, if you add the additional 8% on that, looking at pump prices definitely going, you know, way beyond the 200 shilling mark per litre. But let's look at the region, all right? Rwanda, 0 rated. Look at the economy. Tanzania and Uganda, I believe they're exempt. Kenya is the only country within the EAC that's actually proposing to now increase it from 8 to 16%. And yes, fuel has a ripple impact, but bigger picture, sustainable energy, where are we on that? If you're going to increase the cost of fuel, and you have a very valid point, everything in the supply chain will go up because of the cost of fuel. But why can't we also look at sustainable energy? What happens to the energy from the wind farms? And there are wind farms in this country. Do you see the impact in your electricity bill? No, you don't. So where is that energy being fed into, if not to the national grid, and not impacting your manufacturing sector, not impacting your households? So I think for me, it's a bigger conversation. We need to look at the entire sustainable energy initiative. So do we have solar panels? Can we tap further into the wind energy? What do we need to do to make that more conducive for an investor to come in and say, let me put up, let me import solar panels, but can I get exemptions? I know we do not want the conversation on exemptions because we need the taxes, but sometimes you need to make an investment so that you get future gains. If solar panels come in, cost of electricity goes down, manufacturing companies perhaps would then be able to lower, because the cost of production will come down. The whole essence, I think, is again, will they then forward that reduced cost onward to the end consumer, or will they sit with the profits? If they sit with the profits, good, they get taxed 30%. And the economy still continues. But we need to think about bigger than just focusing on this 8% increase. We need to think about sustainable energy. We need to think about sustainability of the tax system as well. And I'm just going to digress slightly. If you look at what's currently happening with plastic recyclers, for instance, currently you bring in you can bring in plant and equipment exempt. Okay. But the bill proposes to charge VAT on sustainability, right? If a plastic manufacturer is manufacturing plastic products, and then because they have this incentive of bringing in equipment at exempt and then maybe putting up a recycling plant so that there's zero waste, right? They would now be disadvantaged because the cost of bringing in additional plant and equipment, there's something called green financing. To get green financing, it's not easy. You have to meet a lot of criteria. If 50% of your loans are going to go into paying taxes, what are you left with? So I think the conversation is bigger. Yes, the impact, if it comes through, and I hear it's likely to come through, is going to be significant on the economy of this country. Everything definitely will go up.
Okay. Yes, Rispa, you had a point before we proceed to...
Yes, I don't know whether it was more of a question as I listened to Grace, because as we are here, we're also trying to educate the citizens, looking at some of these proposals in the finance bill, what was the thinking behind them? Because for the pesticide and fertilizers, I think we also need to understand how much of it is produced locally. So considering that lots of it is imported, then I think they felt that exempt, instead of a zero rating, would work better. That would make it cheaper if more of the fertilizer is imported. So I think that's a point to note or to look at. But again, we're looking at, is there that possibility of us using organic or getting the fertilizer locally made, and then looking at it from the other aspect of having it zero rated to benefit the manufacturers locally. But otherwise, if we continue to import, then the exemption of the tax is what probably would make it cheaper for us.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I add
and then also
one point that the president in the manifesto and also in the budget that's brought out is this issue of linkages between the MSME sector and these other flagship sectors like agriculture. So it means that you want to curb imports by sourcing the inputs for the sector as far as possible locally. So if you're looking for a technological solution, maybe equipment, you get equipment that you can then source the parts and the inputs locally as much as possible. So there's a whole supply chain that needs to be looked at, and I think that's what the value addition is looking at. So you look at the distribution chain, you look at the supply chain, you also look at the distribution chain, you look at the production, and then of course you look at the local level, because also there, I think there's a need to look at the consumption within the local market, because there are some places where, you know, the residents aren't able to enjoy, let's say, sugar. You can't afford sugar in the part of the country that grows sugar. That doesn't really make sense. So we are expecting a radical transformation, not just a tinkering. And so when we hear that there's an emphasis on even importing fertilizer, you're like, that would have been a stopgap measure. Because I'm sure if you looked at the production of organic agriculture in the country, it's massive. And so we need to move from lip service. Maybe the last point, building on what Sandeep said about the competitiveness, about the external market and the cost of inputs. Kenya has been struggling in the external market because our exports are too pricey, whether it's our commodities or whether it's our manufacturing, because of the cost of inputs. So it's really important to look at this taxation. And it's really important to recognize that reliance on imports is part of the problem that has driven up the cost. So our whole supply chain in manufacturing, our input chain in agriculture is very broken because there is a benefit to importing. There are those people who benefit when you import, much as it's then very, it's kind of put us in a very adverse export exchange situation. So is there the political will and the courage to really transform the way we do business? That is the question.
Sandeep, coming to you then, because an increment on fuel VAT also has other consequences. For example, pushing up the cost of electricity, because it raises, according to this proposal, the fuel cost charge per unit of electricity by 7 shillings, which then means, because we use diesel, that will incur extra cost in terms of paying for electricity. And then we talked about manufacturing. We talked about making the country export-oriented economy and resource mobilized. How then would we achieve that if the cost of electricity is going up, which will have adverse effect and consequence on manufacturing in the country?
So, in my personal opinion, I don't think you can, first, you cannot tax yourself into prosperity. All right, we start with that. there could be other avenues, because you're right, when you talked about the allocation to agriculture, livestock, and then you have now the VAT aspect on fuel, which has a ripple impact into the logistics, and obviously a major impact into the supply chain, because you're looking at manufacturers now having to fork out additional amounts in terms of electricity bills if they've not already included solar panels. You're looking at the government policies and support, and that's why I said the government must support sustainable energy. It is imperative to do that for the future of our food production as well. So when you look at all these things, you have to consider that, fine, if I do not increase the rate of VAT, how else then do I sustain? And we talked about this has an impact into what we are exporting as well, because the cost of our exports is high. And this is one of the major contributing factors. So if we do not manage this, in terms of perhaps maintaining it in the short term, as we look at other sustainable, energy solutions, I think it'll be very difficult to be competitive in the East African market, let alone, globally. And maybe looking at how even the entire supply chain works. She talked about some products stuck at the Lunga Lunga border. I think even recently you must have seen in the dailies that maize was also stuck. Kenya is importing. Yeah. Yet we can grow. You talked about someone uprooting maize. But we are importing. That's why we are a net importer. And so when someone is, those trucks are stuck at the border, maize is rotting. Why? Because Tanzania has decided that you must have a compliance certificate in Tanzania as an importer. Whether it makes sense or not is for Tanzania to tell us. But for me, all I can tell you is that those are some of the barriers to trade, right? If I cannot even grow my maize locally because I'm not getting the right support in terms of infrastructure, I will continue importing. And now that import probably would now be more expensive, say, from Tanzania. So I'll look to a different neighbor to do that. So I think this particular issue around the taxation of VAT on fuel is going to have a major ripple impact if passed. If we cannot, sustain locally, we will continue to import. Yeah. Continue.
Okay. Well, what then logically do you think might explain, and all of you can respond, if Rispa you can, Grace you can, Wanjiru and Sandeep. What then might be the logic that informs Kenya, which has an arable land, to import commodity like maize, yet you have countries like Israel, which is a desert country, grows food and even exports surplus?
Our policies, do we have proper policies in place? Tax policies, agricultural policies, even land policies. And it's actually very sad, as you talk about Israel, which is a desert, we are talking about our productive land, which is being converted to commercial properties, to residential properties, and it is extremely sad. And then we have whatever is left is the kind of now land where we are growing maize and we are growing all these other food produce, which we are not able to get to the market. So we don't have proper national policies for agriculture, amongst others. And this is the reason why I think we're a net importer. And you saw the other day we were also being given sugar, which was supposed to be poison. What are we doing as a country? Yeah, it had been sitting in the borders for years, and then suddenly it's distributed in the market. The government is aware, but nobody does anything about it, and nobody is held accountable for almost poisoning Kenyans.
And in fact, Grace, that's the accountability problem, with the accountability deficits, because there's an integrated agricultural transformation strategy that was generated, I think, some point in 2015, 2016 between national government, county government. But the implementation then comes under headwind. Because when you start to implement a proper agricultural transformation policy, there are people who have to move out of the space and allow the support to go to the small shareholder farmer, allow the infrastructure to be suitably designed and those linkages. So governance, political will, and interests is actually one of our biggest impediments. That's why we don't implement even the good policies that we have. And we see countries, for instance, our special, I forget, African social development policy of 1965 was then borrowed by, is it South Korea? Which they used for their development, and look at where South Korea is. Because in the 60s, Kenya and South Korea were on par in terms of economic development. We developed a policy that they borrowed and implemented, and we didn't implement it. So we have a real problem in terms of implementing things that work. We have devolution. Devolution there's a lot of corruption, and there is a narrative that has been spun that counties just eat. But if you look at the impacts of devolution on our development in the last 10 years, despite all those weaknesses, you can't argue that we need a devolved government, because previously, under national government, you then have to be in the good books of the president to be able to get your allocation. That is where we are going back. So the problem we have is we have good policies. Maybe in some places there are gaps that need to be augmented, but we don't implement. So the question is, how do we deal with this implementation deficit? And that's an issue of political will. And I think citizens are beginning to be very engaged, like this discussion around the finance bill. And the question is, how do citizens move beyond talk? Correct. Because we need to make it expensive for these guys who are saying, suffer a little bit. For another 2 years, your family doesn't have to eat properly. And, you know, it doesn't matter how your economic situation is, but for the better good of the citizen. And the person telling you that is really just increasing their own allowances and their own perks at your expense.
Okay. It's interesting you mentioned Kenya and South Korea, which were at par. And in 1963, Kenya gave out about 10,000 US dollars. That's about 892,000 Kenya shillings to South Korea. That was at independence in 1963. Today, that is a giant in manufacturing world in the world economy, and a key member of the G7 membership countries, and an Asian giant known for its production and manufacturing. Sandeep, as we finish up on this, and devolution. We have talked about the national government, the expenditure, what needs to be done, accountability. 385.5 billion Kenya shillings to the counties. And when you flip through the Auditor General and the Control of Budget report, it isn't healthier either, reading at how that money is accounted for by the governors and the county assemblies across the 47 devolved units. What can be done for them also to take their part in ensuring that they do also utilize that money as required by law?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think, in my personal opinion, first, before you start spending, you must know what you need to spend on. And these are conversations that I know we have had before, in terms of where county governments need to also upskill the people that are within the county, so that they also better understand how to account, what is proper accounting and what is not. But in terms of the expenditure, that would be really what a county wants to achieve, what is their priority. And I think once they identify that, then it becomes an easier conversation on where you need to spend your money. But looking at the AG's report, a possible solution, and I'm just saying it, would be to outsource these audits. So that the AG too is now looking at someone independent, looking at the county or any other parastatal and giving him a report, and then he can then, or they can then, sort of validate. So when you do that, you're doing two things. You're first creating jobs, I would think, for professional organizations. And then the second thing is you have a second opinion over and above what you are doing. And there's sort of an independence. Of course, the AG is meant to be independent, but I think that would really help manage how expenditure is happening, how it's being accounted for. And then again, once an auditor does that, there's always recommendations based on what you've spent your money on in the previous year. What do you think you can do better? I think that would be a step in the right direction.
Yes, Grace and Rispa, accountability is still called for, and clear and deliberate mismanagement of public resources at the counties is very evident. Money spent on unnecessary trips, and the very opposite direction that many county assemblies and governors have taken, and the conflicting position they hold as to what devolution was all about. Devolve power and resource from the center, create positions like the MCF for them to be in close proximity with the people, to hear their cries, legislate what's in their favor, and the clearly different picture which is coming out of our devolved units. How can that be best addressed?
Again, just ensuring, first of all the three arms of government need to be totally independent and transparent and accountable. And number two, all other institutions which have been put in place as checks and balances should also be respected. I think that's where we begin to fail. And therefore, almost everybody within the counties is free to do what they want to do because nobody is checking on what is happening at the county level. And I'm just taking an example on media. Sometimes what we see is true, and sometimes what we see is not true. But where we have, like you've said, expenditure on travel, we have an individual who's traveling out of the country and carrying 23 individuals, multiple staff and individuals who have nothing to do with the trip, who will not add any value to the trip. But they can do that because nobody is stopping that. And as Sandeep had said earlier, we have a provision in this finance bill which allows public servants to spend a lot of money, which is not capped, on assets and on travel, business, what they're calling business expenditure, which they do not need to account for and which is not capped.
Notwithstanding the ownership.
Notwithstanding the ownership, which doesn't even make sense. It just makes an absolute joke of what the law needs to be. Because public servants cut across. There are very, very many public servants. Civil servants are public servants, and then there's public servants. If we allow them to have expenditures which they don't need to account for, to buy assets which are not capped, so there's no value. You can buy whatever you're buying for business travel or, worth 10 million, and nobody's going to ask you a question.
Thank you.
It can be in your name, can be in your child's name, can be in your relative's name. What are we even talking about? And I don't even think I've had enough noise on that.
Okay.
If you'll allow me just
briefly.
a minute to add to the conversation about the counties, what else our counties, I think, is really deep-rooted. As we've all agreed, having the counties or devolution was a good thing. But we look at issues that they keep complaining about. We've had the Council of Governors talking about late funding every other time. So when this money comes late, then they still have to account for Ruto, seem to be spending, then that leads them to spend on things that are really not necessary. Because if they were to spend on development and other things, sometimes the timelines.
Thank you.
You are receiving money in May or on 20th of June or whichever date. That is just really close to the end of the financial year. And there's the auditor that will come and say that you did not spend your budget.
Okay.
Then they end up spending on things that are really useless.
Thank you.
Besides that, I think our counties need to really go strong on own-source revenue.
Thank you.
It would be a good thing to also fill in the gaps.
Asante sana, and at the best interest of time, 30 seconds.
Right. This budget is bad for devolution.
Yes.
The allocations are reducing by the day.
Okay.
We had more money going to the local level of government before this constitution was enacted.
Okay.
Yet the key sectors that give us resilience and sustainability and economic growth are in the hands of the county. So let's deal with the governance, but let us not kill devolution.
Thank you. When we get back from the break, the last 1 hour before the Swahili teams come in, as I see of Grace Mulinge, who is an associate partner, EY. CPA Raspaulik is the council member, ISPAC, thank you for your time. Sandeep Mine is the head of private enterprise, KPMG, your time is all appreciated. And Wanjiru Gikonyo is an advocate for good governance and accountability, your time is all appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, after the break, Faisal Ahmed is in the company of the Principal Secretary at the National Treasury, Dr. Chris Kiptoo, who will be laying an emphasis on what we expect today, the presentations to be made by his boss, the Treasury Cabinet Secretary, Professor Njuguna Ndungu. And here are the live pictures coming from his office at the National Treasury, where Faisal Ahmed will be catching up with him to get more information and further assessment on the expectations as contained in the leather handbag that the minister will be carrying today, as has been the tradition over the years since independence. And we'll be getting the account of Faisal and the Principal Secretary of the Ministry at the National Treasury here on the broadcast after the break. Stay tuned.